here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest this week. It's going to be the turn of the singer, guitarist, songwriter. It's the one and only Emma Pollock, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all that other groovy stuff. Was in the Delgados and has recently brought out a solo album, Begging the Night to Take Hold. Also has a tour that's coming up October 2025. I will put a link in the notes below from her website, so you'll be able to find both information about those dates for the tour and also this amazing new album. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject of the early formative years. And just to say that Emma was going to be having a band practice at 3 o'clock and this was around 2 o'clock. So yes, there you go. There's a little bit of reference to that, just in case you wonder what we're talking about or not. Who knows? Anyway, Emma, tell us about your early formative years.
Oh my goodness, that's a really good question. So my mom and dad were both really into music, but in very different ways. My mum was a real pop fan. She was really, I don't think I ever really heard her talk about David Bowie, which is really interesting, but she was a huge Kate Bush fan, so she was always around in her house. On the stereo, that is, rather than in person, which would have been far more interesting. But she was always present. Joni Mitchell was always present. But my dad was a jazz musician. He not necessarily professionally, but he played the clarinet and the soprano saxophone, and he played what you would probably deem to be the traditional New Orleans kind of jazz. And he played it with some friends in a band on and off throughout his life. And the biggest tragedy is that he ended up getting mouth cancer due to smoking a pipe. So he actually couldn't really play for the latter 20 years of his life. And I think it really broke his heart because, you know, it is an amazing thing to be able to make a sound and to perform music. Suddenly those things were no longer available to him on the instruments that he'd learned to play as a child. So my dad was a really good clarinet player, and it was all improvising, which was interesting. And I used to go along to see him play when I was a teenager, and also when I was in my early 20s, when I was a student in Glasgow, and sometimes the band would travel up to Glasgow to play and I would go see them. And I hated it and also was very proud all at the same time, which is very typical of a teenager and being of an age where it's your parents doing something that makes you mortified but also fascinated. But my mum was the big musical fan, I suppose, and my dad listened to music more from a kind of observational and watching for the skill, the technical skill, whereas my mum was all about the heart of the music, and she was able to spot a number one. You know, she spotted the Bangles' Eternal Flame being number one just as it came out, and of course in those days singles could climb the charts, which was a real phenomenon. You could actually watch something do better every week, which was fascinating. So I had a really mixed attitude to music in the house. You know, my dad was very much about the technical and the old stuff. You know, my dad didn't even really have he wasn't really that much impressed by the Beatles, whereas my mum thought the Beatles were at the epicenter of everything.
Right, yes.
So, my mum was the heart, didn't play, but my dad was the performer, but didn't really listen.
That's
very, very peculiar.
It's interesting you mentioned Kate Bush because I find a lot of albums are quite seasonal or even artists. So I've been playing her first album, The Kick Inside, a lot in the last couple of weeks and been absolutely mesmerised that this young person who must have been 13, 14 when she was writing those songs. Had that maturity and insight, which lyrically is stunning. And then the musicality of the Kick Inside album, which was 78, is phenomenal. And she has that song Moving, which is about Lindsay Kemp, which is the guy that David Bowie kind of works with in the late 60s and sort of gets involved with. And I think, God, you know, you were such a young person. And then there's a song called Saxophone, isn't there? And James the Gun. And I mean, every song of that album is just like blinding, you know. And then you fast forward to The Hounds of Love and you've got side one with the hits, and then side two, a bit like David Bowie's Low, is just full of these kind of incredibly experimental tracks, which are really odd but fascinating. I just think as a performer, she's just out there, isn't she, really?
She is. It's interesting. I don't know if you were aware, but I actually was asked to commission, I was commissioned to put together a show that was dedicated to an artist, and it was suggested that I do Joni Mitchell. This was back in 2016 when the last album came out. I chose to do a show that was dedicated to Kate Bush instead. And it was for the Aberdeen True North Festival. And they had an annual festival, the council. The council are really, really culturally involved and invested, and they have this Aberdeen Performing Arts, which is council funded, and they put on these festivals every year. And True North is a really, really big one. They have a lot of artists come through, a bit like Celtic Connections in Glasgow, but they also used to commission a performer, a musician, to put together a show with other singers and musicians dedicated to one, artist. And of course, the one I chose was Kate Bush. And I pulled together artists, musicians, really, really great musicians from Admiral Fallow and field music, and lots of different people. Graham Smiley in my own band, and Pete Harvey, who's in my own trio now as well. And we played. I had to go through. I think we played 25 songs from across her career. And of course, as a result of this research, I had to, go through every single one of the albums and choose the songs that moved me and represented a career. And it's interesting because some of the albums in the early years left me a little bit nonplussed in some respects because they were so erratic. And I was I could bring it up now, but we'd end up talking about it for an hour. There were I love The Hounds of Love. I think as an album, it's one of the most groundbreaking. It's one of the most melodic. It's one of the most powerful. Yes, it's got the hits, but my God, they're
Yes.
they're running up that hill. I mean, I don't think there have been many songs that have had such an immediacy about them, written by such a powerfully obscure artist in many ways, but at the same time able to touch the lives and musically communicate with such a wide variety of population, and be such a character. That combination is rare. David Bowie did it as well. It's wonderful when art, in its purest sense, does meet success in a very genuine sense, and the art is retained. I think that's a really fascinating thing. It doesn't happen very often. But I really do have to say I absolutely adored the album that came out back in 2005. And it was the one, and I really, to love an album this much and not remember the name of it is quite embarrassing. Ariel. I think that's one of the greatest things she's ever done. Like, I absolutely adore that record because it's full of songs that might not grab you immediately, but my God, the production, the writing, the actual delivery of a lot of I just, is it Mrs. Bertolozzi? It's basically dedicated to a washing machine. There's so much idiosyncrasy about that album.
Yes.
I love it. I love how bold it is. It's got two sides. It's got so much music on it.
Yes.
It's so unique. I love it. I think it's...
Well, I find that, just on the Kate Bush front, I just find that her follow-up albums, which were Lionheart and Never Forever, was sort of, the record company must have been very like, not quite sure. Could we go back to the hits? And then that took, that was quite interesting because they are some great songs on there. But the other album, which I think works as a whole piece, is The Sensual World. I always find that...
oh my goodness, yeah, you're right. Do you not think that sometimes when an artist is as successful as off the bat as she was, that the record company would have been gunning for another record as fast as possible? And when an artist is pushed to make a record and they're not ready, they're their quality control can change, it can slip, it can be. You need time to make a record. I
You
mean, you might
do.
be an artist that needs 9 years between albums, for example. She says in a self-referential manner. But
Well, I guess it's quite interesting because Bowie made one album a year in the 70s, and he obviously was very busy in the other decades. And then, but he also, produced albums. He did live tours. He got married, got divorced, had a child, did films, and did The Elephant Man. I suppose on one level, I think for an artist, I can't remember who it was actually, but one artist who did say, I wished we just, when we got an idea, just quickly followed it through and moved on to something else rather than hang in there polishing something that still was never going to be a classic, but it wasn't going to be the follow-up hit that they thought the first album was going to be. And I think that was his kind of regret. And I suppose with the Kate Bush albums, I mean, she obviously didn't have much time to hang about because I think there was like albums coming out every year, but I suppose it just meant that her processes were quite fluid, or at least, she didn't dawdle on it, and just got through it, and then started with Hands of Love and then Sensual World. You think, oh yes, you've really got it now. I don't know. It's just the thing. I've never made an album, so I wouldn't understand that whole creative process. But I don't know how some people manage to get an album out a year while doing touring. And the dynamics around being in a band and being in a musician either, that must be very difficult.
it's to put an album out once a year or once every 2 years, which is what the Delgados did when we were together, usually means that you don't yet have a family, to be honest. That's what it usually means. And that you're working most of the hours available to you in one sense or another on that music. It can be made a priority. And when you're young, you've got the energy, you've got the cognitive power, you've got the passion, you've got so many things stacked in your favour. And when you're maybe 20 years older, your priorities have completely changed and the music that you make will be of a different nature. And maybe the frequency of output doesn't matter as much to you anymore because you're more interested in spending time with music. I mean, I think I've been lucky enough to, with the last 2 records, In Search of Harperfield and this one, to be able to record something and then go away from it for a few months before coming back and adding to it again. And every time you come back after being away for that length of time, your initial response to that piece of music is really important because you've almost put yourself in the position of the listener, because you might hopefully have forgotten about that song enough to understand what it is on first listen, to understand how powerful it is or it isn't on first listen, which is the one thing that we'll never be able to do as artists, is to understand how a finished article is going to be received by the fan or the maybe not fan or the slightly ambivalent listener who is hearing it for the first time. And these days, with attention spans being what they are, and us having on streaming, us having the keys to 90% of the music that's ever been recorded and released, it is quite something now to capture someone's attention and to hold it long enough for them to maybe go and listen to the whole album.
Yes, absolutely.
And so there's a lot to be said for giving something time to go away and come back and understand what it is that you've made.
Yes. Well, I remember sort of in those, I was an 80s indie kid, but it was the John Peel show that I was kind of obsessed with, which was quite lucky because I'd grown up and had a brother who was older than me, about 7 years, and he was into that prog rock period. So I used to sneak into his room and listen to these records with kind of amazement, not knowing that prog rock was going to be incredibly unfashionable years later, and thinking, God, why wasn't he into punk? But he was into prog, that was it. So
I know plenty of people into prog. Honestly, it's going to come round. It's going to come round.
Yes, I'm sort of coming out of the closet with it. I sort of, some of those albums are great, but it was just interesting in that sense that like you said about attention span, that those albums were really quite, a lot of work to sort of sit there and listen to something for the first time not having any kind of prior knowledge to it, but just being very curious, especially when you're being banned from someone's bedroom and you think, oh, I'll just go and sneak in and listen to them. And you'd be kind of like, oh my God, this is extraordinary. What is this? And then quickly putting them away. Because you mentioned about, songs that came into the charts at number 35, and then, they might go to number 28 the following week. So it was a real slow burn, wasn't it, in those days? And so you did sort of hear it and you thought, I'm not sure about it. But by the 10th time you heard it on the school bus or in the shops or just on Radio 1, you began to sort of kind of embrace it a little bit. And I think having time to listen to things is important. So yes, the John Peel show, when I used to play it, I used to always put a TDK D90 cassette in and record the show. Because the first time you think, oh my God, that was just too much, John. You had the Bundy Boys, Public Enemy, you had death metal, you had indie pop, Gregory Isaacs. It was too much. So you're right. I think you do need to sit with something for a while to capture, that moment where you kind of start to really become or enter into the song much more. So for an artist, it must be very strange.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been fascinated with first responses to music, because they're so responsible for whether we move forward with something or not. And actually, the first responses, or the first time we listen to something, it is extremely powerful. I mean, even just this morning, I was listening to an album for the very first time. It was a new Grandaddy album that only came out last year, and my partner came out the bathroom and they said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's a new Grandaddy album." And they said, "That's great." I said, "It's been on for a minute and a half." And she already knew that she loved it.
Right.
And it was fascinating because that whole idea of I think sometimes we respond to, first of all, a sound, the sound that something's making. So, for example, we put on like a metal band and we might know immediately that we don't necessarily want to hear that anymore if it's not what we're into, because we recognise the genre and we recognise it as a general feeling, a general sound that doesn't make us feel the way we want to feel. However, in a different day, in a different mood, it might be exactly what we want to hear. But it is so powerful, sound, and what is it that makes us stick with something, and which then might even become one of our favourite albums of the
Yes.
year. I mean, one of the recent Angel Olsen records, which I think is called oh God, it's the one that came out maybe last year. It sounds quite country, actually. It's definitely not what I remember of her when she recorded All Mirrors. But this album it took me quite by surprise because it sounds quite country. And I'm going to just make sure that I'm getting the name of it right here so that I can actually talk about it without it being
Yes, I don't sort of guess that song, guess that artist.
Yeah, exactly. It's not. So let's see. Let's get this right. So it's Angel Olsen and yeah, it's called The Good Times. No. It's called Big Time, right?
Right.
The album is called Big Time, and I adore this record. And I think that it's when I first heard it, I thought, oh no, I don't know about this. This sounds really country, and I was quite put off. And I thought I would persevere. And it turned 180,
Right.
Oh my goodness, I didn't associate this sound with Angel Olsen. It's very raw. The songs are very here instead of being quite, out there and expansive, which I think All Mirrors is like. And now it's one of my favourite records because it is so unbelievably melodic and touching and authentic and sincere and all of those things.
Nice. So coming to your new album, which it's quite interesting you mentioned that, a song that grabs you, because can you guess the song that really What a, I've never done this before. The song that grabbed me, can you guess from your album which one I thought, oh my God, this is just amazing. I need to just play it straight away again. Because I thought it was just musically, you had that cello, you had the piano, and some very evocative lyrics, which I thought, wow, that's incredible. Yes, guess that song. This is quite, you could be
Well,
hit.
okay. Now, the cello and piano being there isn't going to help me because I think it's pretty much across the whole album.
Yes.
Lyrics that carry weight. Maybe I used to be a silhouette.
Yes, I love that, the last track, but I love Jessie, My Queen.
Really?
Yes, that
That's
was the one.
interesting
It
because
was the
that.
one. It's the one that I thought
Wow,
was stunning. Yes.
that's fascinating. Okay.
Yeah. So that was
Wow.
when I kind of heard that. I thought, God, this is a great, I love the imagery. I love that kind of lyric.
Okay.
It kind of moved. It was just stunning. And it was really, and then you had
Yeah.
Black Magnetic. And then I started, and then I listened to it a few more times. And then things like Something of Summer came and then Future Tree. And I thought, oh yeah, this whole album is kind of, it's growing. But, it's like, yes, the first time you're thinking, oh, okay, that's interesting. Lots of cello, piano.
Mm-hmm.
I love the vocal, but kind of not really sort of catching all the lyrics. And then that one particularly was stunning. I thought, God, there's something really evocative about that song, actually.
Oh,
So when did the album start to develop and the musicality of it? When did you decide it was going to sound like this?
well, do you know, it was definitely inspired by events in 2019 when I decided to go away for 5 nights and write for a time on my own, which I'd never done before. And I went back to Galloway, which is where I grew up mostly from the age of 10. And Dumfries and Galloway is southwest Scotland. And I went to a place called Rockcliffe, which is on the coast, next to a fishing village called Kipford. And these two twinned little coastal villages are very, very pretty. They're very beautiful. They're very desolate and very empty, particularly through the winter. And I did write quite a lot at that point. I wrote Black Magnetic. I used to be a silhouette. I wrote Fire Inside. Um, I did write a fair few songs there, and I wrote Jessie, My Queen, because I took a wee trip into a place called Kirkcudbright, which is a very, very beautiful coastal town on the Solway Solway Firth, and I went into the museum in Kirkcudbright, and they had an art they had an exhibition absolutely dedicated to Jessie M. King,
Oh,
who is the song that the artist, the Scottish artist that this song is dedicated to.
right.
Now, Jessie M. King was a children's illustrator, and after just as the First World War broke out, they'd been living in Paris. Her and her husband, who was a painter, who was E.M. Taylor, and they moved back from Paris, and they decided to settle in Kirkcudbright. I think they both had maybe gone to art school in Glasgow. Don't know. She's one of the Glasgow girls, and I think E.M. Taylor might have been one of the Glasgow boys. I don't know if you're aware of the scene
Yes,
that kind of
slightly.
emanates from, Glasgow School of Art a century ago, and maybe even after that, from that point. But I loved the fact that she'd been discovered essentially. Well, I didn't love the fact. I found it infuriating that she'd been only really appreciated and discovered after her husband had died and after she had died. And her work is absolutely beautiful. She was also a ceramicist. The things she made were just gorgeous. She had such an artistic eye. Loved colour. And there's a story about her that is referenced in the lyric, that when she answered the door, she was quite antisocial. When she answered the door, she always had her hat in her hand, so she could say, "Oh, what a shame, I'm just going out," if she
Excellent.
didn't like
We
the
should.
person at the door. Yeah, which is a fantastic way to handle social interaction, I think. And she always wore black. She rode about in a black bicycle, and the children used to run after her and thought she was a witch. So she was this fantastic character who was regarded probably as completely unfeminine, completely against the grain and very strange, I'm sure, at the time. But my goodness, what a... I mean, it's funny, you can appreciate a person without necessarily thinking you want to meet them or be their friend. You can appreciate them for what they brought into the world and how they were quite an individual. And I do think that all of those things were true of
Yes.
DMK.
So there's the reference to Paris then. Where does that come from in the song?
That's because they lived in Paris before the war broke out, and they decided to leave the country, they decided to leave France, probably due to, I think, was it occupied in the First World War as well? I can't quite remember.
I'm not sure about the
I'm
first, but
not
yeah,
sure.
that's
Yeah,
fair enough.
but they moved to Kirkcudbright because it's known as an artist town. Kirkcudbright has got beautiful light,
Right.
and an awful lot of the Glasgow boys moved into Galloway and the Borders because of the light, and they painted lots of pastoral scenes when they were down there
Right. My
with
God,
cows in fields and things like that.
So
Yeah.
were you writing, was this kind of lyrics and poetry that you were writing, or had you also taken a guitar or anything else to?
Yeah. I was writing. The music generally comes first, and then the lyrical content will come off the back of it. There will be melody first, and then there will be lyric, and then eventually the whole thing shall come together and become what it is.
Right.
Yeah.
I just think that is I think that's just, like, for me, that was my standout track. But,
Well, I should tell you a bit more about it, actually, because the song didn't work for a long time.
right.
It really didn't work because now let me get this right. I don't think the verse was strong enough. So we were in the studio in 2020, me and Graham Smiley, Pete Harvey, and a partner at the time. A lot's changed in the last few years for me. And I was just really not happy with Jessie, my queen. So we just couldn't grasp it. We tried to play it live. It didn't feel right. It wasn't gluing together. And I went to the toilet, and I swear I rewrote the verse, and I came out and I said, right, try these chords instead. Try this melody. I sang a new melody, and suddenly the song was there.
Yes.
Absolutely remarkable.
It's
Honestly, music is an extraordinary thing. It can come in a flash and you don't know where it's come from. But you know when you hear a particular combination of things, whether it be chords or melody. Phrasing's a wonderful thing. It's very powerful. You can tell when all of these things come together and make something complete, because you no longer want to change it, you only want to hear it over and over again. And I had not got to that point until this particular day.
Wow, that's amazing. Because there is a sort of lovely tension in the kind of, I think it's the cello, and it builds, and then there's that very evocative chorus that brings in this idea of Paris. And I don't know why, there's a sort of romantic melancholia to the track, which I sort of kind of felt. And there was a little that kind of switches. And I just thought, God, this is a great song.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm really proud of it. We're not playing it live, unfortunately, because we don't have time to play everything, as well as a cross-section of other albums, so we're not necessarily...
Yes, I could imagine that. So then, yes, that's kind of amazing that there's so much went into it. And because some people go, oh yeah, that song came to me, and we just, we had suddenly 10 minutes, or we were told we got to write another track and for the album, and we went away, and in 10 minutes we got this one, and that was the big hit. So it's interesting that some songs... That can also happen as well. So with the album, because it has a real theme to it. Did you spend a lot of time with the kind of the track listing? Because obviously it ends with "I used to be a silhouette," which feels, that finish, because it's like 5 minutes, and then the last bit is quite an atmospheric, kind of moody piece. Did you spend a lot of time sort of working on the sort of the way it sort of arced through from the beginning to the end?
To be honest with you, that always comes at the end, because you don't know what you've even got until you've got the songs. And so the songs are always there are songs that didn't make it onto the album. There are songs that just didn't justify themselves because they weren't quite finished. But the songs revealed themselves. Like, for example, Jessie My Queen didn't reveal itself until that day, didn't really reveal its, like some of the other songs didn't reveal themselves till they were mixed. So an album doesn't reveal itself until every single thing is finished. And then you're thinking, right, okay, so what is the collection here? And again, this is a really not old fashioned. I don't really like that phrase. I think kind of makes something feel less relevant, which it isn't. I think it is true to say that the modern access to music does not celebrate the track listing in as much as you can choose to listen to a song without hearing it in context. You can choose to listen to a song without listening to the rest of the album. That's really common now. But for artists, it is still all about the album. It is still all about 10, 15, God knows, it could be 20 tracks. It could be a prog album. and then you're thinking, what do we want to bookmark this with? What's our opener and what is our closer? And then for vinyl, what's our interim closer and our interim opener for the end of side A and the beginning of side B? You don't know what you've got until everything is mixed and finished, and then you get to rediscover it all over again by considering an order.
Right.
And that's a really interesting thing, because then you're making a journey of the songs themselves.
Yes. And when did you decide to use, cello and piano? When did you sort of come across or decide what the musical landscape was going to be, rather than more of a
The traditional band.
Yes, that's it.
That was actually quite early on, to be honest. That was in 2019. There was discussion. That idea came in. I think I'd decided, partly inspired by the live environment, that I was going to go on tour with field music, who I adore, and I know Peter Bruce quite well, become a friend. And they asked if I would play with them on a few shows, and I said, "Oh my God, I'd love to do that, but I can't afford to bring the whole band." So I decided that it would just be the trio. It would just be cello, piano, guitar, vocals, and a bit of bass guitar.
Yes.
That's exactly what we did, and it was joyful to play like this live. And it was just before the pandemic. It was January or early February 2020. And we were days away from the pandemic locking everything down. And we were still out playing. And it was so joyful. And I love the flexibility of less instruments. You get to dig into a song. You get to ask yourself, what is the song? What can we do without? What can we not lose? What is the song in its essence? And once we've decided what instruments we can get away with, in this case, the three, what happens if there's no drums?
Yes.
When this song over here used to be played with drums. And so we revisited some songs that came from older albums that had been recorded with full drums. And suddenly you're looking to the cello and the piano to create rhythm as well as melodic content. And suddenly you're rearranging songs that are 10, 15 years old. And that's a really fascinating and exciting thing to do.
Yeah. Well,
and then, of course, it lent itself. I decided that this was a wonderful setup, and I decided that the next album was to be that setup.
Perfect.
And so it was actually quite early on that decision was made.
Yes, because when I was listening to it, it did remind me of, because I adored, Joni Mitchell, and I love this album she did probably 20 years ago, where she revisited her material, but did it kind of with a small orchestra or big orchestra, but actually all just focused on the lyrics and the sort of sentiment and the vocal. And I think, and I love that kind of, because suddenly those songs that she sung in the 70s, which were quite, with a guitar, suddenly seemed really different when she was just delivering them just with this kind of orchestral quality. And I think it kind of gives, I guess it gives the songwriting a lot more attention because your vocal is much more pushed to the fore, isn't it? And then as a listener, we're sort of kind of really engaged with the story of the song and the narrative. And I think that's kind of fascinating. Did you, when you realised that you were going to use cello and the piano, did you sort of feel you were going to have to write slightly differently for the album, or?
No, I didn't. And this is what's really interesting, because I think that songs in their nascent kind of form, in their form of, I mean, I write mostly on guitar, but I can also write on keyboard, even though I can't play the damn thing. I can come up with chords and chord shapes, and then I'll go to Graham Smiley and I'll say, I've done this. Could you make it better, please? Could you play it properly?
Yeah.
But I'll know the chords that I want because I've already recorded them on an iPhone, for example, or a little recorder. And then from that, the song in its nascent stage, in its simplest form, then responds to the instruments that I decide I want to use. And it is extraordinary how much dynamic and form and expansion and quiet can all be found in that trio. Like, honestly, it is remarkable. I find, and I was on Six Music not long ago, but 2 weeks ago, with Mark Riley, and he was commenting on, the arrangements and how you're only using these instruments, and yet the album is so rich and so expansive. And the funny thing is that it is the sparsest record that I've ever made. So you've got to ask yourself, well, what's the difference here, really, when there's no drums to speak of, apart from the odd smattering here and there, secondary to the other instruments? And I think it just goes to the power of arrangement and the power of the players that I was playing with.
Yes.
They wrote extraordinary parts. They wrote parts that were not just accompanying; they were melody. They were melodic instrument. Like they were bringing in melody in the same way that I think the early Nick Drake albums, like Five Leaves Left, the at least I think it's Five Leaves Left I'm talking about. Those albums launched that string arranger's career, because they were so unbelievably melodic. You think about Billie Holiday's early, like a lot of, not early, but later actually, like things like Lady in Satin, which I think was the last record she ever made. When you listen to string arrangements of that period, you're reminded that they were brilliant in their own right. You could mute the vocal and still listen to those songs and enjoy the music for its own sake. I think sometimes modern string arrangements can be padding, they can be chordal, they can be simpler, but less melodic. But in this case, the space allowed the cello and the piano to introduce rhythm and melody and to go to town with it because there was enough room.
Yes, it's interesting you mention Nick Drake, because he's another one of those. I don't know if you have it, but there's certain artists and albums that come in a seasonal way, and Nick Drake's always one of my autumnal albums that I start. And John Martin's Solid Air is another one, which is actually about Nick Drake. But there is a sort of a sense of kind of hibernation, and then obviously Joni Mitchell's Blue album. And again, you're talking about sort of putting a whole, the tracks of an album together. And again, I think that last track is Last Time I Saw Richard, wasn't it? I think that was the last. And it kind of works. You put it on side one, and then eventually you get to the end of side two, and you feel like you've been on this kind of emotional journey. And that's why I was wondering, when you were looking at the track list on this album, where you finished with the one Silhouette, whether you felt like this is really the closure of this particular album and project.
Yeah, but that decision was only made once all of these songs existed, which is really interesting because I mean, at the end of the day, an album is usually, I mean, of course, not always, but usually, a stamp of a point in time for that artist and where they are. And that's why the album is still crucially important as a collection of song and work of that artist at that point in their lives. And when you consider that an album might be written over a period of a year or 6 months or a few years, then that's a lot of emotional, that's quite the patchwork quilt to pull from. And it's interesting to realise that, there will be really upbeat tracks like Future Tree, really playful tracks like Jessie, my Queen, really like darker tracks like more meditative tracks like Black Magnetic, and darker tracks like I Used to Be a Silhouette, and they're all part of the same life. They're all part of the same experience of life over a period of years. And
Yes.
that's quite accurate. That's what life is like. We move from sorrow to joy to maybe a quiet space to a loud space. We do it all within a day. We're so changeable as people, and I think it's really interesting when an album can represent either myriad emotions, or some albums, of course, capture one emotion quite strongly. You could probably say that Pink Moon is a fairly singular capturing of emotion. Everything's very delicate and quite vulnerable and quite, brittle.
Yes. Well, fruit. I don't know which one had Fruit Tree on, but yes, it's kind of his. And I think Joe Boyd produced those, didn't he? Those particular albums. Who did the Incredible String Band and such bands like that. So so with Black Magnetic, he says so fluidly. So what was the kind of story behind this particular track?
Well, I mean, it's a good track to ask that, actually, because it does have a story in that. I was in Rockcliffe. I was staying in a bed and breakfast, or a kind of studio up at the top of a hill, and at night I would walk down the hill to the shore as a breather, to get a breather from writing. And one night I saw a few girls. They were sitting on a rock out on the shore, and they looked about 17, maybe 16, 17, 18. And I just suddenly began to think, I wonder what they're talking about. I wonder what their plans are. I wonder what. And it reminded me of my age of 17, growing up in Galloway and wanting to just get out, to just leave, because Castle Douglas is where I grew up. It was such a small town. I didn't really like the dynamic of a small town. It was very gossipy. My mum didn't really love it. My mum and dad divorced. Well, no, they didn't divorce. They separated not long after I left home. And so my memory of being in such a small small town in rural Galloway wasn't necessarily a great place for a teenager, at least not for this one. And I'd got into university up in Glasgow, and I was really happy to leave not long after I left school. I actually got a job as a nanny down in England, and then a few months after that I started university in Glasgow. So Black Magnetic was all about this pull of leaving, the pull of what's out there, the pull of what's out there across the water even. Not wanting to stay and not knowing what's out there, both of those states at the same time. And also the excitement that brings of being that age.
Yes.
All of that kind of fed into it.
God, you sort of, yes, that was quite interesting. Your sort of moment on the beach with those teenage 17-year-olds.
And they didn't know that I was obviously conjuring up this response, but yeah. And I don't know who they were. I can't even remember what they looked like.
But it's quite an evocative moment there, really. So, what does Future Tree? Is this another one of the songs that you wrote when you were on your 5-day retreat?
No, Future Tree came at a different time. Future Tree is interesting because I now understand what it is, and I didn't before. Future Tree is about the ultimate and utter and constant distraction of a mind that is constantly coming up with different points of interest and focus, and wanting to move on before being ready to before actually really being ready to move on, because I may not have finished the thing that I'm already inside. And so basically, last year I was diagnosed with autism, and so there's a whole chunk of writing about what it is to be neurodiverse in Future Tree without me knowing that I was writing about it. So
Right.
so that's quite an interesting song in its own right because of that single fact alone. But yeah, Future Tree is basically about being constantly called upon by curiosity, constantly interested in other things that are just out of reach, but maybe abandoning the thing that last week I had thought was really interesting and grasping it for a while. And so autism, ADHD, probably a combination of the two. Yeah, the appeal of the unknown, the distraction, the endless possibilities, the future tree, the idea being that the branches are constantly splitting and splitting and
Right.
splitting, and it's probably also an idea of the way that our lives develop through time. Um, you could get philosophical about it. You could talk about the idea of determinism versus free will. You could read lots of things into those lyrics. What is it that makes our future, and how much control do we really have over it
Yes.
at any given point? Because it feels to me like we do live in one channel of an infinite multiverse. Because depending on whether I, I can walk past a bookshelf and see a book and pick it up and read a chapter, and it will influence maybe a decision that I make the next day.
Yes. That's
We're,
interesting.
we all live, I think, in a fairly random world. Chaotic, it's a chaotic system.
It is very quick. But your degree was in science based, wasn't it? You
Yeah,
were
it's physics. Yeah.
so you must have quite a logical mind and sort of ability to, like, because I know people who are scientific and their kind of character is a little bit more introvert. They sort of look at an issue or problem and they just want a bit of quiet to sort of figure it out, and then they'll figure it out and then just go, that's it. Whereas an extrovert could come into the room, they haven't read the room, they start talking, you think, oh, God, wish you just kind of, that's not quite what the vibe was before you walked in, so but you've sort of made it a bit tricky now. You know what I mean? And often that kind of, you just wish people would sometimes, have just certain things that they could do when they enter spaces and stuff like that. So were you quite an introverted person who could look at a problem logically and then sort it out and sort of have a methodology about it?
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved maths. I've always loved science. I've always loved problem solving. These are things that I adore, and they don't necessarily, on the face of it, they are not necessarily creative on the face of it. But I think in practice, these things are very creative. I think that maths and music, for example, cognitively have a lot in common. And for me to write a song is a bit like solving a problem, because I get to dive into what could be an endless possibility of chord structures, melody, all the rest of it. And I'm just rooting around, in this box of possibility, finding something that I catch because it's interesting and I like the way it sounds. And then I have to try and decide, well, what does it suggest? What is the way it sounds like? What does it suggest it might want to do next? And you go on a journey with these chords and you end up being inspired by the thing you've written. It might suggest something moving into the future. What is that? Is it a chorus or a middle eight? Is it a bridge? And then eventually you might find I don't know if you play music yourself, but I love something called modulation, which is basically when one key changes and becomes another key, that the song moves around keys. And David Bowie did this very, very beautifully in much of his music. You think you know where you are in the landscape, and then suddenly you're up here because he's shifted key. And it
Yes.
sounds fascinating and beautiful and really interesting, but sometimes you feel a pull to go back to where you were. And a really good songwriter can make these things happen without making the listener feel exhausted. And I find modulation to be utterly fascinating because it is like problem solving. It's I want to go to this key because it's interesting, or I find myself in this key because it's interesting, but maybe I want to try and get back to where I was to be able to play the chorus again. How do I do that? So there's a lot of problem solving, but there's also a huge amount of emotive impact.
Yes, well, I think as a listener, I do love that kind of shift of gear. He says as a listener, where you just think, oh wow, that's the way they've seamlessly gone into that and then come back again.
Yeah.
I do think that those little moments can really, rather than when you hear a track and it's a little bit like, oh, that's kind of nothing, unless there's an amazing lyric or something. But it's those little moments where you just have that little trip and you think, oh, that was nice.
Well, I mean, one of the best records I think for songwriting and being utterly like a showcase of what a song can do is probably David Bowie's Hunky Dory.
Yes.
Like I think Life on Mars and things like that. It's almost like modern, like at the time, a modern day like Bach kind of. Bach used to write the same piece of music in different keys, almost as an academic exercise.
Yes.
Because keys in those days were fascinating because pianos were made, or pianofortes were made in one key. And we hadn't yet, and I say we, the world of music makers, had not yet worked out how to tune a piano so that everything could be played, all the different keys could be played.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
That, from a mathematical point of view, is one of the most interesting things to read about, the history of the piano. And the fact that when you listen to a piano that's actually tuned in a particular key, and I mean strictly in that key, not what they call now there's a name for if you talk to any piano tuner. I used to wonder why the job was so goddamn difficult. I used to wonder why
It took so long.
it took so goddamn long to train, right?
Yes.
It's because there is no such thing as a perfectly tuned piano.
Right.
And so I could tell you why it's mathematical and it's brilliant, but I won't do it just now. Go and look up something called the Pythagorean comma
Oh,
or the black dog.
Black Dog. That's so Nick Drake.
It is. Well, the black dog is clearly, also a reference to depression, but the Pythagorean comma, there are lots and lots of names for this, but pianos tuned modern day tuning that you can play Happy Birthday starting from any note.
Right.
That didn't used to be the case. You used to only be able to play Happy Birthday in one key, and it would be the key that the piano had been built in, had been tuned in. It's utterly fascinating.
Yes, because I think Rick Wakeman is the piano player on Life on Mars. He says, I hope so.
I think you're right.
Yes, who would obviously had that classical background that he could bring in, and it's interesting because I was a little bit, I get these exciting moments in life, and go down rabbit hole.
Sorry. Can you, David? Could you give me a second?
Yes,
That's need to probably a musician at the door. I'm just going to let the bus some points. Yeah.
Dear old Rick Wakeman. So the tour, which is going to be coming up next week, this is quite an exciting tour. This is with the three of you going around the country.
Yeah, it is.
So, yes, have you started rehearsals? Or, no, you
God,
have.
Yeah,
oh, God, of course. Yeah. Yes, that was a stupid question.
Oh, no, but I mean,
you're on Six Music, weren't you, last week?
Well, I mean, the start of it wasn't perfect, so we still need to rehearse.
Yes, absolutely. And you've got your track listing. I mean, is it quite tricky because you've got so much material? Are you thinking, oh, we're going to have to do, bits from the band, bits from my solo album, early solo, as well as, trying to sort of say, hey, I've got this new album. How do you sort of, manage to do that to keep the fans happy and yourself content?
The majority of the songs will be pulled from the last two albums, because I think that they're the albums that I feel are more representative of me as an artist now. And I will be pulling from the first two, but only little bits. So the majority will definitely be this album and quite a lot from In Search of Harperfield.
Yes.
But there won't be anything from the Delgados at all.
Fair enough. That's easy. A lot of people often say, "God, we can't play that stuff for various reasons." One being, actually, I just can't remember how it goes. So that was too long ago. It was 40 years.
Yeah.
I can't. I'm not going back there. It was,
Yeah.
and I wrote those lyrics when I was very young. But look, Emma, thank you ever so much for your time. I'll let you kind of focus on your band practice for the afternoon. But thank you again for doing this. And that, dear listener, is just about the end of the interview, apart from a few more little chat about this and that. But yes, the band practice was about to commence, so I had to make myself scarce. But a massive thank you to Emma for giving me the time for this interview. This has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. So if you want to contact me, you can on those social media platform sites. Just do C86 Show. And all these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Have a great week. Stay safe.